agree that let's get started.
Yeah, let's get started.
Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Jay Rajagopal, and I am with Colorado Common Cause, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we are here with the Colorado Sun and Carol Wood, Eric Lubbers of the Colorado Sun, State Representative Lisa Cutter, Sandra Fish, and Robert Tann of the CU Independent. And we are here today to talk about independent journalism and new media, because with the COVID-19 crisis, I think we're all learning that ever, and it can actually save lives to have important information available and to make sure that that's accessible to folks. So Carol here will be moderating the panel for the next hour, and we will be accepting questions throughout. So without any further ado, Carol, go ahead and take it away.
Great, hi.
I'll be monitoring the chat.
Yeah, welcome all who are here, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more joining us in the near future. But you know, we are looking at the importance of independent media and local media at all times, but particularly during this time. And you know, prior to the COVID crisis, there was a PEN America study that found that more than 1,800 newspapers had closed in the 15-year period between 2004 and 2019, and that 47% of newsroom personnel had been slashed. And many cities and entire counties became news deserts, and Colorado was not immune to that. And you know, that was calendar year 2019, and the last 2 or 3 months have absolutely exacerbated this crisis. And you know, journalists have risen to every single occasion here since the COVID crisis. And you know, at the same time they're rising to the occasion, they're wondering if they still are going to have a job. And so we have several questions here that I'll just start. And like Jay introduced the panel, Rep. Lisa Cutter from Evergreen, Jefferson County. Eric, is that right, Lisa? Evergreen?
Yeah, Jefferson County. I don't live in Evergreen, but that's a bunch of my district, yeah.
Okay, Jefferson County. And then Eric Lubbers was one of the founding members of the Colorado Sun, and I'm the COO and the business development director there. But Eric and 9 other folks left hedge fund-owned media in Denver almost 2 years ago to launch the independent Colorado Sun. Sandra Fish is a independent journalist, a data journalist and instructor at CU Boulder, does a lot of work for us and a lot of other great, works for a lot of other great media around the state too. And then Robert Tann, who is a senior, I believe,
Junior
this year at CU Boulder, and executive editor of the CU Independent. So let's throw some of the questions your way that have come in. I'm going to start with what is one thing, panel, that you find uplifting and one thing that you find concerning about our current media environment? And you know, I don't know who wants to start. I can pick a person, or if somebody wants to jump in. One thing you find uplifting and one thing that you find concerning about this environment right now.
I'll go. I think that the determination of journalists to pursue the hard questions, I see a lot of determination out there, and I think that's really uplifting. So I love seeing that. And I think the thing that's concerning is just the what you mentioned when we let in the erosion of media, the fact that resources are shrinking and the ability for journalists to go out and do enterprise reporting is diminished.
Absolutely.
I can go next. So one thing that I'm very excited by, just by like from what we're seeing here at the Sun, but also what we're seeing kind of around the entire industry, is that this is the moment where people seem to be recognizing the importance of journalism. Like the readers are extremely, we're getting more traffic than ever. Everybody's getting more traffic than ever. And at the moment, it's also it's very clear in a in a situation like this with such public health sort of implications, how important it is to have not just one, but multiple good news outlets in your area asking questions to try to dig up information. And then to say the one thing that's concerning, obviously, is that a big chunk of the existing outlets are still really highly dependent on the mechanism of advertising for their funding. That's, you know, still how a lot of people are paid, you know, to do journalism. And that's all but dried up here. Trends that we knew were happening to journalism because of Facebook and Google and places like that. This has just kind of hit the gas pedal on it. And we're in this liminal state right now, you know, kind of waiting for shoes to drop, even though some of them already are. We just don't know how many more shoes are left to drop.
You know, one of the things that I'm really excited about and am doing a significant amount of work with is something called the Colorado Media Collaborative, or CoLab. And like, check your local media this weekend, print, digital, radio, TV, because there's a ton of journalists from around the state, and I mean around the state, went out today to talk to people about a day in their life. And it's going to be a really great package with all sorts of great perspectives. And that is just like the start of this collaboration, and it's really great. On the other hand, you know, a lot of journalists I know, my friends, are being furloughed. They're being forced to take like 3 of the next 11 or 12 weeks off. I've seen journalists entirely laid off in Durango and other places. And it's concerning, because who covers the news in these communities if there aren't any journalists left? I think I saw that there's like one journalist reporter at the Canyon City Record now.
Yeah, I think just kind of all of those were what was on my mind. As a student at CU, as a journalism student, and as someone who's been doing student journalism with the CU Independent, something that I see that is really, that makes me optimistic is the pursuit for media literacy. At least I believe that there's been more of a desire among the public to really know their journalists, to really understand how journalism works, especially at a local level where it impacts them the most. With things like social media, especially Twitter, I see journalists interacting all the time with their readers and their members in their community, which is just really awesome. I think journalism sometimes has this like veil over it, where, you know, it's kind of like the media, and it's easy to label and see it as kind of a faceless entity. And I think having things like social media around has been really great to kind of like pull community together and get community members to know their journalists, to kind of understand more about that process, which benefits everyone. And I'm really happy to see that continuing. And yeah, I mean, the downside is there is, just like everything that everyone mentioned, there is more pressure now on newsrooms to be able to afford themselves, to be able to have the bandwidth to cover these communities. As communities in Colorado grow, newsrooms are shrinking, which is a very scary thing. And it's scary to see, you know, for-profit newsrooms like the Denver Post forced to furlough and have pay cuts when there are, you know, so many stories to tell and so much information to get out. And yet at a time when we need more people, we've got less. So I think, you know, it's just worrying that when a situation like this comes around, this is the way that corporations react to it.
Right. And, you know, one of the other questions that kind of ties in to what you all just answered is, this one came in. It says, we're hearing a lot these days about what parts of the economy are going to bounce back from the coronavirus-induced recession. So how do you think that news companies and independent media groups are going to fare in this recovery? And what can the average person do to help local journalism during this crisis? And I'm happy to repeat the questions as we go through. So,
I'll go ahead and jump in. So one of the things that I was kind of getting to is that, and Carol mentioned this before, we've seen so many of these institutions already hit. Like this was not just something that happened during coronavirus. This is something that's been a steady downturn, more because of the way that what's called the attention economy works. So it used to be that newspapers and TV stations were the only game in town, and that's where you had to go for all of your information. So because of that, they could charge a premium for advertising on that, and they were able to afford really good journalists. Like that was the whole game in town. But then with a lot, and this is something that I'm not sure that everybody knows, but it's out there. If you take every dollar spent on advertising right now, 85 cents, and probably at this point more, go to either Google or Facebook. So every single other outlet that you've ever seen, all the news sites with ads and all that stuff, they're all competing for a slice of that extra 15 cents. And that's been part of the reason that this has gone down. So you've seen probably a lot really recently of these both large corporate sort of news, but also smaller independent news asking for membership. This is where I think we get to the answer to the second question is, it's going to be really hard for the people who are really still reliant on advertising to bounce back, because not only is it going to be that it's always hard to get started again, to rebuild revenue after it's gone, but a lot of these businesses that they are relying on are also going to be rebuilding at the same time. So it's definitely going to be an up and down kind of thing for them. I think smaller groups will have a little bit better chance, because they've focused more on creating a level of community that's actively supporting them. And as much as I'd love to say that, I wish all of the Colorado Sun type, things can do it all, we know that's not true. I mean, we're going to lose something no matter what if we can't maintain the same number of journalists asking questions out there. So, and it's hard to be optimistic about sort of the advertising based people, but I also think that something new is going to come out of this for sure.
Yeah. Who wants to take that on next?
I think that one of the things that happens here is people are going to have to pay for news, but I think that the model, this historic model that for-profit companies, especially print companies, have of we're just going to depend on subscribers and charging them what, to my mind, is often in just exorbitant amount, and hoping that they don't notice the monthly charge on their credit card bill. I think that's not going to work anymore. And I think that I think that the hedge funds aren't going to care if they shut down a bunch of news publications, because they'll have gotten their money out by selling real estate and things like that. But I think that the public has got to learn that they need to find a way to pay for news. And I think the industry has not stood up and found some good alternatives to this print subscription model.
Right. And so we look at how larger news companies will fare and how smaller independent news groups will, which the smaller, more independent ones might be more nimble and not have the overhead that larger legacy media does. But along with that, what can the average person do to help local media during this time? Thoughts on that aspect of this question?
I would love to answer that. I think that I'm thinking in a little bit of a different way. First of all, obviously there's a subscription, but subscribe, support. People are getting more used to that kind of model, I think, just because maybe this is a good time, right? This is a crisis, and this has all been going on for a long time with the erosion of media. And now there's a crisis, and people are like, wow, we really need good media. Mm-hmm. So this is journalism's time to shine, right? And I think the individual can support those publications and local media with subscriptions and so on. But I also think that it's our responsibility. So I'm looking at this through sort of a media literacy lens, and I really appreciate, Robert, that you mentioned that. I think that we can all be responsible for sharing good news stories, quality, by that I mean quality news sources, talking about that with our friends, and just sort of elevating that. Like a few years ago, I got in the habit of, which made some people very cranky, but got in the habit of saying, hey, is this actually true? You might want to check this, on Facebook and stuff, because that's where everyone goes, is the Twitter, the Facebook, the social media. And so just holding people accountable and saying, you can do it in a nice way, saying, hey, this is easy to check. This is a good, credible news source. So I think we can help elevate good journalism and support good journalism in that way as well.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's a really, that kind of raises another great point about both supporting journalists financially, but also supporting their work and celebrating their work is huge. So, when you, as Lisa said, when you see a good story in the Colorado Sun or another outlet, share it, tweet the journalist's name, share the byline, get some exposure, get it to circulate, because that gets more eyeballs, that gets more readers, that will, maybe if you've already been a member, you've donated to these outlets, but by you sharing those stories, you get it to 10 other people who haven't yet. So sharing good content is another important thing. And speaking again, like as a student at CU, something that we've really been pushing with the CUI is trying to make it known that while we're a student-run news outlet, we serve the entire university community, and that means building relationships with the faculty, the staff, the colleges, and getting them to, writing stories that impact them and that also, reflect their voice, and having it circulated through their channels as well, which has been really big and important for us. So just don't just read like the Twitter headline. If you see a story that you think, oh, this is interesting, like open it, spend the time, read it, tweet it, Facebook it, share the author's name, and follow your reporters, all that kind of stuff.
That reminds me of one of my favorite little sayings I can say. And I say this to everybody, from college students to everybody like I know my age and all my mom's friends. Like I say it all the time. Don't ever share anything that you haven't read. Like it sounds so simple, but as soon as that gets into your head, you will realize how often you're about to hit retweet or share a headline and you haven't actually taken the time to click through it, because there's just no way to get the nuance of what's actually in a story just in the headline. And often the headlines are written in a way to make you feel a really specific emotion. And it's not manipulative, but it also just can't tell the story. And so make sure that you actually know what it says. And a great thing to do too is find a really good quote or a really good line in the story to use as you share something, because that can really suddenly give an extra hook for why you care about the story. And that really helps other people understand why they should care about it too.
Absolutely. Good points. And we have a question from someone who's tuned in here now, and I'm going to combine it with another one. So this question is, what is your stance on censorship? And I think we can tie that a little bit to another question that we had earlier. Someone who said, I'm concerned about misinformation and lies that are by necessity carried on live TV, primarily White House press conferences. And then later, these things are fact-checked for corrections. And by that time, the misinformation has already become part of the conversation, part of the online conversation in print and on air. So how can media avoid becoming a part of misinformation or the propaganda machine? And I do think that ties in with censorship. So, does anybody want to tackle that?
So the very first part, just to talk about sort of the live airing, it's funny working in a local or regional online print-based text-based sort of like news, how often the media, when people say that, it's almost always cable. Like that tends to, like, if somebody's got bad things to say, it almost inevitably is about a specific national cable, because that's still a remarkably powerful way of people getting their news. There's still a generation beyond generations of people who just sit and watch, and that's how they catch up. Like they just kind of have it on all in the background. So I would say that especially here at the local level, like state or down, like regional sort of downwards, we don't have that same issue. Like almost everybody, even the TV news stations here, there's a strong level of filtering that happens, and a lot of like interpretation and making sure that we are only reporting on what the real stuff is and holding them accountable in the actual text rather than just like pulling it out live. I'll go ahead and let somebody, I talk in paragraphs, so I'm going to let you guys jump in and interrupt me. And if you want to get into other parts of that.
Well, I think I'd love to address that. I think that what will build media up and will continue to serve media well is by being credible, right? And so I think that it is the responsibility of media to report on credible things. So I honestly haven't given much thought. I know there's been discussion about, should they cover the press conferences or what, but really, I don't believe in censorship, but I do believe in facts and accurate information. So to that degree, I think that's how media earns its reputation. And face it, there's not a lot of trust for media right now, right? I don't remember the statistics, but it's not great. Or politicians. So we're right there with you. So we have to do better and earn that trust by being a credible source of information, by fact checking. And so when I talk about media literacy to groups, I ran some legislation last year on media literacy. And when I talk to groups about it, I always try to educate people on how to learn what a credible media organization is. And part of that is that there's filters, right? There's editorial filters. You put things through. You have a policy on, editorial policy, and you have fact checkers and things like that. So we all have to be accountable to that, to earning that credibility and checking the facts before we report on it. So I am grateful when there's a filter, even if you do have to cover, press conferences or things as news, then at least there should be sort of some check on the facts or non-facts that were reported there.
Yeah. And as close to real time as possible, just to add that, like that's
exactly.
to get to the question asker's concern there. There's the old line about, a lie gets around the world before the truth can put its shoes on, like it's that's sort of the aspect that we're dealing with as consumption of news has moved to be so much faster and more instantaneous than it ever was in the day where you got one newspaper and that was your like summary of the day, and then maybe you got one evening news broadcast, and maybe a little bit of news radio through the day. Now we're so far beyond that where it is just 24/7 all the time.
I'm working as a fellow for First Draft News, which is an international sort of fact checking, but also trying to stem the tide of misinformation. And I think not only does the media have responsibility here, but consumers have a responsibility too, to not believe everything they see on Facebook, Twitter, or Insta, or even on TV. And we live in challenging times. The country is really divided, but all of us have to make an effort to try to come together and try to see other people's perspectives. And we all carry some responsibility for sifting out what is true and accurate.
And reading the article, not just the headline.
Yes.
My other one-liner that goes with that. Oh, sorry, Robert, I'll let you get there.
No, I want to hear your one-liner.
The other one-liner is basically, if you are having a really strong emotion reading a headline, there's a good chance that that's not exactly what the story is, because the real world is sticky and it's gray and it's not black, it's not white. Like there's a lot to it. So if it really just fits right into your wheelhouse, either for or against the way you think, there's a good chance that it might be stretching the truth a little bit. Like, so that's another one, like, to just temper yourself as you are looking at this thing, and then maybe try to, you know, find one or two other outlets reporting on the same story and kind of compare and contrast and sort of look for the ways that what the real facts are.
Yeah.
Okay,
Good
Robert,
point.
it's all yours now. Sorry.
Well, no worries at all. That's great. I was just going to bring up what the Colorado Sun has been doing with their credibility indicators, and this kind of pivots a little bit just from talking about like how you would cover, you know, the president's press briefing or misinformation in real time. This is a bit different than that, but it's really great to see outlets like the Sun using these credibility indicators to tell readers, that there was original reporting, that there were sources cited, that there was boots on the ground reporting. I think as much transparency as a journalist can give to a story and how that story was reported and what the process of reporting and writing was, the better for the readers. And I think that's something that journalism can still improve upon. And again, I think my theme of the night is kind of turning into like social media. I don't know. But it goes back to like what I was saying earlier about just online interactions with journalists and their readers on platforms like Twitter. And I think it's both a responsibility, like Sandra said, of the readers to, not trust everything that they immediately see and to dig into the stories and educate themselves and look at the facts. But it is also the responsibility of the journalists being the ones that have the platform and are in a lot of ways the bearer of those facts and information to explain how they got them and explain context around the facts, because a fact doesn't mean, a fact isn't always, a fact also needs context, I guess is what I'm saying, and it needs to be explained. So the more interactions that journalists can have in a casual sense, like on a Twitter thread with readers, I think will serve everybody. And the more that we can see things like these credibility indicators, I would love to see that on every outlet. I think that's just such a great idea, and it's really cool that the Sun is doing that.
Yeah, and I was going to reiterate that, Robert, that if anybody goes to, and I know there's other independent news sources around the country that do this, but if you go to a coloradosun.com story, on the left-hand side of those stories, it does tell you that there are sources, multiple sources cited, editors check the facts, credibility indicators. And then if it's a story that happens to be from, say, Durango or Grand Junction or Yuma or other parts of the state, oftentimes we'll have an indicator that says that's boots on the ground, that we had somebody in that community personally touching base with the sources there. So I do think that that's a trend, Robert and Eric, that hopefully will continue and does add accurate credibility to a lot of reporting.
And I think this might hit on a couple of the other questions that we have in there too. But I mean, one of the biggest issues we have is people not knowing how journalism works. Just basic facts about like how it happens. Like, so that's how you can get the idea that the idea that anonymous sources are made up, and that's like a thing that like the president pushed for a while, but a lot of people have pushed for a long time. And that's because they don't know that anonymous sources, if they are ever printed somewhere, the person knows who they are and they've made a decision to either help them hide that. But if people don't know that, it's very easy to believe like, oh yeah, if it's anonymous, and so education from the reporters towards the community about the process of reporting and the ethics that go into it and when things get reported and when they don't is a really important part that is definitely on journalists. Like, we need to be doing a really good job of making sure that people understand how things work.
But if I can add to that point, the thing, we think about, you were referencing earlier, I think, Eric, about how, there'd be one newspaper and, Walter Cronkite on the news. Right. And that's where everybody got their news. And look at what has happened in a generation. Look how significantly media and our relationship to media has changed, and social media and all those things. And so, I think my generation is sort of lost. It just all happened so quickly. Although I do remember the two newspapers and the TV. But there's just this place where I think it happened so quickly that people didn't really know how to catch up. And that's why media literacy, I'm so passionate about that. And I really, like, I'd love to see, before all the crisis, the pandemic happened, I talked with some colleagues about doing some just informal media literacy events all over through libraries or whatever. But I really hope to see it. I'm working on another piece of legislation to actually implement it into the standards, because I think that's really part of education now, right? Like,
Yeah.
you discover a new planet, you revise the science curriculum. This is like a new planet. There's a whole new way of doing things. And so the onus is on us a little bit as a society to try and educate people and bring them along with all the things we've been talking about: how to know if it's credible, how to be a responsible consumer of media, how to check things, how to trust a journalist, all those things. So I hope we can start to implement that for kids, so that they come up with a different understanding of how to evaluate sources.
Sure. And I have a follow-up question from Karen, which kind of ties into some of this, and then we'll go to a new question. But her follow-up is, when there are experts in a story, quoted in a story, on opposite sides, are we, as the media, willing to allow both voices to be heard? I like to think at the Colorado Sun, we are unaffiliated and we are unbiased, and we don't tell people what to think, but we try to teach people what to think. That's my opinion, but I want to hear from the panel. Experts on both sides.
I did a story for the Sun this week about mis and disinformation surrounding coronavirus. And I think that there are some instances where there are not two sides. There are not any known successful treatments or cures for coronavirus. And so to represent, like, I'm seeing people out on Facebook representing that certain combinations of things, and I'm not even talking about hydroxychloroquine,
Right.
but I can almost spell it. But there are people talking about all sorts of combinations of things, and there's no research backing this up. There is no evidence of it. And in those instances, there aren't always two sides.
Mm-hmm.
And people may be representing themselves as a side, and I think that's been something that's been exploited pretty thoroughly by the creation of a whole class of sort of like experts just to try to counterweight on certain things. But I mean, the clearest way to make sure that you don't, as a news organization, fall into the sort of both sidesism that there may be two sides to something, but that does not necessarily mean that both sides have an equal share of the truth. And so that's the key thing, is to stay really focused on the facts of your story. Make sure that you can independently verify them as many ways as possible. And then you give as much oxygen as is necessarily as associated with the truth. So you definitely try to stay as much as you can unbiased, and make sure you're not leaning just for partisan purposes, but there's a lot of opportunity to make sure that you're only elevating the voices that actually can be backed up by verified sort of information and sources. And then if you do have to include people who don't have verification, make sure that every single quote that they include in there has every possible context for who they are, who they're working for, all that kind of stuff, to make sure that no one's surprised or being manipulated by the stuff you're putting in on what your platform is. You have that responsibility to make sure that misinformation doesn't get out on on the stage you've set.
Great, thank you. So we have another question that came in on the Q&A. Ryan says, I feel like there should be more stigma for lies. So do we have any idea how that can be accomplished? And I want to tie that to another question, where somebody says, so many times in recent news coverage, I've seen individual reporters and networks demeaned, called names, called fake news, while they are doing their job and doing their best to inform the public. They take the criticism without much pushback. And what effect do you think that's having, both personally and professionally, for people who work in the media? And again, should there be more stigma for lies in those scenarios? How should that be called out?
I mean, that's the hard part, is that stigma by its definition kind of requires sort of your personality to be involved, and it's a very social thing. So it's not necessarily something that you could, because they news outlets do this. So if somebody lies, they will say, yeah, this is false, like we like, they call it out there. It's the social aspect after that is where there doesn't seem to be as much, as long as you're in a certain sort of like realm. And this isn't even on one side or the other. This happens on both sides of the aisle, where if you are in your echo chamber, then pretty much you can get away with saying whatever you want, and that core base isn't going to care. And so this is a much larger issue than just making sure that media is willing to call out lies. Because I think you've seen a more evolved way to handle it, thanks to dealing with this administration, just through like provable falsehoods that come out through official channels now. So you're getting more chances for these media outlets to actually say it straight up. This is false, but that can only go so far. And as for fake news stuff, if you've ever met or talked to a journalist, most of the time, if that's happening, that just really makes them more convinced that they need to get back to work and get out there and do it even better. I mean, so it's making them more convinced that you're supposed to be comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, is the whole point of being a journalist. And so if somebody who's that comfortable is feeling afflicted, then you're kind of doing the right thing.
In some ways too, I don't think people realize how cruel some people out there are to journalists. I mean, I've had people calling and emailing me for decades and just saying like really tacky things. Somebody once typed that I was a puta in the outhouse, which I sent that email to all my friends. But people do this, and a lot of us just get these thick skins and are like, yeah, whatever. But it's interesting to see somebody at that level, someone who is considered our leader, stooping to using such petty language with people.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Robert, how the presence of that affects young people still wanting to be journalists. What do you hear at the CU Independent and from your colleagues at CU Boulder J School, why they still want to do this?
Yeah, well, it doesn't scare us off. So that's the important thing. And to Eric's point, when we hear it, and at least when I hear it, and we've talked about this a lot in the CUI newsroom. For those of us that are really looking at a career in journalism. And in a way, it just makes us even more passionate and dedicated to get out there and to prove this wrong and to really fight against this really disturbing narrative that is taking hold in the United States about fake media and fake news, and the journalism is out to distort the truth and to hurt the president and his administration and all that stuff. It's like a wake-up call almost, that we really need more journalists than ever, more dedicated journalists than ever, a diverse range of journalists who can tell stories in different ways, tell stories that differ from the conventional forms of print storytelling that we've been seeing, and break into new demographics. I mean, journalism will be stronger and better if we're able to communicate our stories to as many people and as many readers as possible through whatever means that is. If it's more of a focus on like multimedia and visuals, that's stuff that, like, again, at the CUI, we've really been trying to like kind of look at how readers are digesting the news. But kind of circling back to how this kind of rhetoric and both on the national and at the state, because like on the one hand, like we have it on the national level. I think journalists are treated with a lot better respect locally in their communities, although I still see some pretty atrocious stuff on social media. But I think it is better just because we have a more personal relationship with them. But still, you know, it's important for us to understand that this is kind of a call to action. And I think it makes us feel like we're needed more to push back against this. So there's definitely kind of a sense of solidarity, you know, with student journalists that kind of see themselves years down the road of like, well, that could be me. And, you know, I really need to, you know, fight back against this and give it my all.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And we have a question for Representative Cutter here that I'm going to pivot to next. And it says, part of the difficulty new endeavors have in gaining a foothold in building sustainable journalism projects is explaining the new media paradigm to potential stakeholders and potential donors. Most people view media through the lens in which they consume it. They don't make a distinction between for-profit or non-profit or other models. And it's great that you are working on media literacy issues. Is there any other outreach that you and other political leaders can do to help explain these models or issues to the general public? And the footnote there is the Colorado Media Project has raised the issue of public funding for media. And where do you stand on public funding for media? And I can, again, it's a long question, happy to repeat it. But it also has to do about literacy and media education. Yeah. And I, for one, I know we're a public benefit corporation. The Colorado Sun is. So we have a stated mission to benefit the public. There's other nonprofit models, and obviously there's for-profit, corporate, and hedge fund models. And so how do we go about, from a public policy standpoint, educating the general public on these different models?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess I'm taking it to the very most basic level, going to schools, K through 12, just trying to set the foundation. I think to some degree, it's hard to address adults in a global way, people that are news consumers on a regular basis. But I think, let's see, I'm trying to remember all the parts of the question. I personally try to do it, and I know that a lot of colleagues try to do it. I know that my former career was in public relations, and that's why, and I started out studying journalism at CU, so long time ago. So all those things sort of come together here in this space. And I know that a lot of my former colleagues in PR are really focused on that, educating people about media literacy and about the new media and how to be good consumers. So I think that's just something individually we're trying to do, and a lot of my colleagues at the legislature as well. But I think that, and you ask about financing, I think, too. And I do know about the Colorado Media Project, and actually I would really like to, I've been to one of their presentations, a roundtable thing, and I would like to get more involved with them and figure out what, if any, public policy does need to come out of this. I'm really interested, and would, depending on the exact policy, obviously, I'd want to examine it and talk to people and make sure it was the right approach. But just theoretically, I completely believe in doing anything we can. I think journalism is such an important, critical part of democracy. I mean, I'm so thrilled to be here with all you guys. Are all my heroes, and I say that with complete sincerity. I think people out there fighting the fight and telling stories at whatever level and whatever kind of stories, that changes lives. That makes a real difference. And so I would love, I will plan on, as long as I'm at the legislature, I will plan on continuing to explore ways to help support and uplift media through public financing, whatever options, education, whatever options are available to us. Great. Did I answer all those pieces?
You did, Lisa, thank you. Are there other panelists who want to address this a little bit on media literacy and how we help explain sometimes very different models to the consuming public?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's about that. So we hit it a little bit earlier about sort of it has to be a little bit of a group mentality. I mean, you trust your family and friends more than you trust journalists, maybe, especially people who might be the ones sharing like either bad misinformation or something like that. If I could wade into their Facebook comments, and if they don't know who I am and I explain all this stuff, they're not going to care. They won't have much there. But if it's somebody that they know, just kind of gently explaining, like, yeah, there's some problems with this. This is an industry-backed magazine, or yeah, this quote that this person has, like they're paid by this industry or that industry or something like that. Just doing like basic sort of stuff like that will help build those skills into it. The other part of the question about the public funding is really, I mean, it ends up being really sticky. I mean, like, obviously journalism's a public good, it's this bizarre sort of middle ground where it's a public good that is keeping an eye on the public, so like the idea of having government funding of a place that is ostensibly being a watchdog for the government, by definition is a little bit contradictory, that you would not want to bite the hand that feeds you. On the other hand, I mean, you've seen places like in other countries like the BBC and things like that, like do a lot of really good work with a really hands-off sort of structured funding model. So it's a debate that's definitely happening right now, because we just know that like it's coming, like something like this is going to get proposed somewhere, and someone's going to sign on to it and some people aren't. And so it's a matter of kind of figuring out what the new sort of journalism ethics are, and how to make sure that you don't ever look like you're biased in favor of the place that is, or the government system that is technically funding you. But we also know the money has to come from somewhere to keep the same like level of journalism happening. So yeah.
Great.
It's complicated.
Right.
It is. Other thoughts on that? Sorry, other thoughts on that panel? Or we can move to, we do have another question from the audience. Okay, I'm going to go to Walter's question. And he says, what opportunities are there for encouraging public school districts to incorporate media literacy, i.e. ways of verifying information that is spread through various social media platforms into their curriculums? So I guess I would maybe interpret that on public school districts teaching media literacy to young students. And if I've misinterpreted that, please chime back in.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Well, I'd like to hear from Robert about that.
Yeah.
Because I think that young people are really savvy about social media. So Robert.
So I read an article a long time ago, and I feel bad that I can't remember the outlet, but it was basically it was a study, I believe, on some statistics on age demographics and their ability to identify misinformation. And I'm a proud Gen Zer. And I believe we are the best at identifying misinformation and just kind of cutting through.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's my generation that is problematic and is doing the sharing of bad stuff.
Without reading.
I think to tie those two things together, I mean, so there's a generation that was so used to implicitly trusting the very few number of news sources that as the number and quality of news sources exploded and then also lowered, they carried that same level of implicit trust with them. So some random blog that happens to be, saying some like really particular partisan thing that makes them feel good or bad or angry or whatever, feels they trust it as much as they trusted Walter Cronkite, saying that there.
Right.
Whereas Gen Z is like, they have literally grown up surrounded by media, like not even just through news, but through the way that entertainment works and reality TV. If you get a drink or two into me, I will absolutely tell you my theory about the way that reality TV is actually helping people understand manipulation in narratives better than than previous generations have before. But I think that's where those two sort of things come together.
And it's a really interesting question because, you know, we think about in K through 12, you know, we teach students civics. You know, I took a civics class. I did social studies because it was a responsibility of the education system to, you know, inform us about the workings of our democracy. But what we didn't learn about really was journalism. I think in civics, you know, it might have come up once or twice, but it was not. It didn't even have its own, you know, kind of topic dedicated to it, or like we're going to spend X amount of weeks doing you know, looking into journalism and democracy and its role and all that, which I don't think makes sense because to Lisa's point, which she said earlier, I mean, journalism is such a vital part of democracy. I mean, it's part of it's one of the, you know, gears that makes the whole thing work, and it should be part of curriculums today, I think. Either whether that's to be incorporated into a civics class or something else. I wish that I had been more educated, and I really had to kind of get most of my education through what I've done just in the last few years at CUI and in my classes, which is great. I'm very so thankful for those opportunities that I can just get real world experience. But I kind of just jumped into the deep end. Like I got to CU and I thought journalism sounds really cool. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I always loved storytelling, and I loved talking and talking with people. So journalism just seemed like a great avenue for that. But I wasn't, you know, I didn't have a bullet list of what journalism was or meant. And I really have figured that out in these last couple of years. But I would have loved to have more of a grounded kind of understanding of that at an earlier age.
Well, so last year I ran the first piece of legislation on media literacy education, and we had to, because of the way we had to ease into it a little bit by doing a committee, media literacy advisory committee, and they spent the whole summer studying best practices, what resources are out there. There's a lot of existing resources to help with media literacy. So they spent a lot of time putting together a report, and that bill, the second bill, the piece that's going to implement those things, to your point, into the curriculum, is on the table right now. So obviously we don't know what's going to happen. I'm hoping, I mean, ideally we'd have dollars attached and be able to provide some website or something for educators to go on and get more info. But in this climate with the budget right now, we're not going to be able to do that. But I'm hoping that at least we can run the rest of the bill, because really all it's going to be doing is implementing those recommendations into standards for civics, reading and writing. So I think that's kind of a no-brainer, right? And I'm hoping that, you know, and they do a standards review every so many years. And so hopefully we'll be able to get that passed and get it implemented. So it's integrated more. And you should also know, we heard from a lot of teachers, a lot of educators, in doing this, and a lot of people are doing it already on an informal basis. So there's a lot of teachers focused on that.
Yeah, I would love to see a really solid curriculum that is made available, you know, as freely as possible for every school district. You know, if obviously the federal level would be the best to make sure it gets everywhere. But we all know how deeply local schools are. You know, like it's hard to do anything kind of top down like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say, for one, on the, just shout out to Robert, because as a CU student, he was an intern in another newsroom that I worked in where I was regional editor, and talk about jumping in both feet forward. And that's the sort of energy that we need in our newsrooms right now. He came in, sophomore or junior, I don't even
Just
remember.
wrapped up my sophomore year.
Yeah, sophomore year. And was always willing to do whatever was asked of him. Learned every single subject that we threw at him, and did.
I didn't have a choice.
Right, and did the boots on the ground work. And so to see that kind of enthusiasm, I think, coming up, and it's no wonder that you, as a junior, that you're editor of the college paper. So I think that you know, the more Roberts we have coming up through this, then the more hope we have. And the next question I want to jump to, and Lisa, this might not necessarily apply to you as much, but for the others on the panel, how does the media determine its priorities when choosing what to report on and how to report on it? And we could probably go on, so let's try and limit that a little bit because we do have a lot of other questions. But yeah, how does the media determine what to report on and how to do so in Colorado?
Yeah.
I'm looking at what we do here.
I know that working about the Post and now at the Sun, a lot of the conversation was about audience, like who are the actual people who are going to be reading and what is going to be impacting them. And so a lot of it, especially here at the Sun, since we've been able to focus and slow down a little bit and kind of do more in-depth stuff, has been specifically about impact on people, like making sure that if there's making sure we're covering everything as comprehensively as we can, but if we have to make choices between things, is going for towards the greatest impact for the most people whenever we're trying to tell those stories. And I think another really quick one is we have a really long ethics policy on Colorado Sun. So coloradosun.com/ethics. And that was something that we actually crowdsourced with readers before we even wrote a story. As we were getting out there, we wanted to make sure we had it in place and could be sort of our constitution to go back to whenever we thought about what we were reporting and why we were doing it. So that's definitely the way that we do things at the Sun.
I think people have a lot of meetings too. Where newsrooms talk about what's the issue of the day, what's the city council doing, what is local government doing, what are businesses, how are they faring? Like right now, every story is about coronavirus, right? But there's a lot of talk back and forth in newsrooms about what shall we cover. And I think, probably we could do a better job of bringing people into those meetings sometimes and seeking people out to participate.
I don't think people understand the sometimes white hot friction rage that can be between an editor and a reporter based on what they are bringing to the table and what the editor is saying is the important thing. And so what you see is a nice clean byline and a headline and everything like that, but it is pretty much every story you see has been forged in fire. It has definitely been one of those situations where only the good stuff has remained because we've gone through a lot of fights.
Next question, Lisa, this might involve you a little bit more. Do any of the panelists know of a situation in the last few years where foreign agents or foreign actors have tried to influence Colorado citizens through the media? Is that anything that you hear about at the legislature or other panelists? Anything that you are?
There seems to be some evidence that the British group, whose name I'm now forgetting, Eric, remind me if you can remember, did get involved in some Colorado Senate contests by providing some information on Facebook profiles back 6 years ago in 2014.
Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah. And, I read the book written by the guy from there, and I call BS on some of their stuff.
Yeah.
I call BS on his book.
Yeah.
And him.
I will definitely agree that I think the Cambridge Analytica thing the whole scandal was a little bit insulting to people, basically made people seem a little bit more manipulative, or the effects of that manipulation being much greater than it actually was, versus just regular media, so that the difference between something like that, somebody hacking everyone's Facebook profiles, creating these, they use all these fancy words about psychological profiles and things like that. It didn't have quite as much effect as just the overall tone of the way that the media was reporting on both that election and other elections too. And I know that it's pretty difficult, especially at a state and local level, for foreign actors to get involved, just because there's less distance between the reporter and the subject, and like there's a lot more common knowledge. So any reporter worth their salt is going to triple verify a source that they get, and almost none of the foreign actors that you've heard about in sort of these other areas would survive even one round of even like slight verification. Like it would just completely fall apart. That's not to say that there aren't people buying ads targeted towards people that are funded by other countries. Like that's definitely happening, but not using the media in the way that it's been reported in some other sort of more national ways.
Lisa, do you have any?
Well, I just to echo what basically what both of them said. I mean, there was rumors of things happening, and I just was thinking that we have discussed legislation on like deep fake videos, for example, with the Secretary of State. That's one of her priorities, is protecting our elections and disinformation. So that's something we discussed, and we're maybe going to run legislation on, but it doesn't look likely this year. But there definitely are efforts like that. But as Eric said, it's probably more difficult to do at this level.
Sure. To take another question from the audience that maybe you want to take first too is, should media literacy be required in college? Should college requirements include at least one class on media literacy?
I'd love to hear Robert's opinion about that too.
I want you to start with that one.
You go take it first, Robert.
That's interesting, because we just had, we had the question earlier about public schools, and for some reason my mind just kind of went to like K through 12, and like I thought of high school. Also, kind of as a side note, I spent kind of half of my my life in London growing up, so I came into high school very late as a junior. And so, most usually take civics class your freshman year. I had to take it as a junior, and I had to take health and all the other fun stuff. But it was interesting getting like thrown into that and like seeing different ways that the different education systems handle it. There seems to be way more of an emphasis on things like media literacy, history, with the UK system that I experienced, at least. So that's kind of like a side note thing I just wanted to like bring up. But in terms of college classes, that's a tricky one, because my personal opinion as a current college student is I really do not like prereqs. I really don't like being told, well, you've got your major, but you have to take 50 credits in blah blah blah, and you need to get your science knocked out of the way.
Plus they cost money, every credit has a dollar amount to it,
Exactly. And if I could really have trimmed down my freshman year and just focused on journalism and maybe some other complementary studies, that would have been great. And I really wasn't able to get into the thick of my journalism studies until my later my sophomore and now upperclassmen years. So personally, I would say that kind of teaching is best at the K through 12 level, just because I believe that, well, that is when young people are more impressionable, and when they really need to be absorbing vital information to shape the way that they think about the world. And that's why we put such an emphasis on things like science and math and health studies. And I think journalism and media literacy should be on that list as well. Going back to what I said earlier, I think it should I would love to see it wrapped into some sort of a civics class, where it's really to really show students how hand in hand journalism and our democracy goes. Or if it were to be its own, course, I'm not really sure what it would look like. But yeah, personally, I think it would do more good and have a greater impact if it was done with students at a younger age, either in that middle school, high school range. Forcing it upon college students, I also just don't know who would really, if people would pay attention. Like, only the people that want to know would know, and those people are going to know anyway because they're driven to. So
it's a habit that needs to be built, and that's the issue about it being at the college level, because you're like, I will say that, like, I grew up in a very small town. I'm from Yuma, Colorado, out on the Eastern Plains. And so, like, didn't have a huge amount of exposure to sort of media in outside of the newspaper, and a little bit of the internet when it was just sort of coming in while I was in school. But I don't think I really got my habits done until I was working on a newspaper in college, and so like it's this weird thing where you want to build the habits for information verification when you're really young, when you're learning everything, and then you need to reinforce it through college and into adulthood when you actually start having a house or having kids with a school system where you suddenly have more you care more about your region, and you then have to reboot those habits.
I like the way you put that in terms of habits. Like, that's what I think too. I think it should be like muscle memory. When you're a kid, you just do it. That's just what they do. And kids are so impressionable, like
tying a
have
shoe.
Such a grasp on social media, and they get it. So I think it's just a matter of training them from a really early age, and then they shouldn't need it by the time they're in college, right? You're gonna, hopefully you have some critical thinking capacity if we've done a good job with the public schools. So I agree completely with that.
I would like to offer a challenge to you all who are engaged civically to reach out to your kids or your grandkids, nieces, nephews, the kid next door digitally, and watch the city council meeting next week or the week after. Follow the reporter who's live tweeting that meeting to see what they say. Look at their news story that comes out before the meeting to tell us what's going to happen, and the news story they write afterwards. One of the things we talk about media literacy, but I think there are so many people, I cover politics and government. There's so many people who have no understanding of what government is, how they operate. You can download your local, you could download salaries maybe from your local school district or something, and learn to do Excel and some percentage differences and things like that. A budget could be a math project. This is a great opportunity to teach some people on your own.
Yeah,
I will say that any young person, I mean, to the degree that I can, sometimes we're busy or it doesn't work out, but almost any young person that wants to reach out to me and learn more, I'll have them down to whenever we go back, I'll have them down to the legislature. I love nothing more. I can't recall that I've ever turned a young person down from wanting to come help or learn or shadow me or something. That's really, really important to me. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's great. Good stuff. And kind of on media literacy, but this is a little bit different because sometimes the public doesn't know what our terms mean. And so we have somebody asking, can you talk a little bit more about subscription models? And by a subscription model, do you mean a paywall? And with a subscription model and or a paywall, how do you ensure that news stays accessible to those who cannot afford the fees? And how can people continue to read a variety of news sources without having to subscribe to all of them? And that, I think, is an outstanding question. I don't know who wants to take that on.
Yeah, I mean, you landed on the multi-million-dollar question. It's really like at the Sun, we knew that we were starting from scratch. We had no real audience. We were building it from there. So it really wouldn't have made financial sense for us to have a paywall, but we've also adopted it as a mission, basically, to make sure that everything that we put out is readable. And so kind of the way that we do things is we are trying to inspire you to support us versus kind of force you to read that, which that's great. It works for us. It's not going to work for everybody. And that's something that you see around where you have massive audiences reading tons of news that the vast majority of them have never paid a dime to read that, and somewhere there has to be a way to be able to monetize that, since you can't rely on the advertising like we talked about earlier on. But yeah, accessibility is a major concern with us, and I think a lot of other sort of independent news that's out there right now too.
Yeah, and so the difference between subscription and paywall, because at the Sun, we don't have a paywall. We never have. We don't ever intend to, but we do ask people to support us.
Right. We are a membership organization, which there's not a huge amount of difference between subscription and membership in practical terms. But one of the quick ways is like a membership is more about you volunteering to support something that you find value in. Whereas a subscription is more, I am paying and getting a product in return. And so that usually tends to be the more either paywall or it's attached to a print magazine or print newspaper or something like that, where you're actually paying for a product versus showing your support.
Robert, how is the CUI model now? What's that like?
Yeah, so I don't know if, so this was kind of news a few months ago, back in December, but the Media College announced that they were pulling away from us financially and essentially having a sever of any sort of financial reliance. So for the last several years, we have been directly funded by the College of Media Communication Information, with some advertising revenue and donations kind of making up the other slices of the pie. But now we're faced with the task and the challenge of moving into a new financial future for us. And it's great timing amidst coronavirus. But we kind of, to Eric's point, like we're hoping that through our work, like that will speak for itself and that will speak to people for the reason why we should continue to be supported. And we're looking at a lot of options, and it's interesting because it goes back to a discussion that we were having earlier about government funded options. And I know this is just kind of at the student level, but I think it is kind of a microcosm for a lot of things, because one of the options we're looking at is going through our student government representatives. We've been in conversation with some other college papers who have kind of like a 50-50 model where they get fiscal year funding through their student government, and then they make up the rest in ad revenue. The Rocky Mountain Collegian is a great example of that. But it's interesting to see like how all these student papers and all the different ways and how creative they can be about finding their funding. So right now we're looking at trying to kind of have as many eggs in different baskets as we can. And I think, again, like that doesn't work for everyone, but I think for student papers maybe, and certainly for us, I think it's going to work for us to try to pull from different pools and not just be solely reliant on just one entity of funding. And I think like we're going to really try to push to get support from the student government, increase our ad sales, which is something we've been able to do over the last year, which has been really great. Push for more donations. And of course, we're a student newspaper, so we don't have a paywall either. But yeah, I think just like looking for different pools will be really important, and not just putting it all on one form, because if something were to fall apart, then there goes our entire support system.
It sounds like the real world, Robert.
Yeah,
it's exactly what we all
you'll see that in a lot of you'll hear diversification as a pretty major plank of anyone's future plans at any level of organization, is making sure that it's not one, because you see what has happened now. If advertising is your only game in town, it's not going to be sustainable. So yeah.
I want to take a minute here to invite more questions from the audience. We've had some great ones. I have some others, but if anything has come up during the last hour or so that someone wants to type in and ask, please do so. And I also want to take the time to acknowledge our host here for our happy hour this evening, Colorado Common Cause. And certainly with the decline in local journalism, we need more and more monitors in small communities and in large communities to keep public business, the business of the public, transparent. So with that, anyone is welcome to sign up for the democracy watchdog that Colorado Common Cause has. And I believe that there is a link in the participant chat for that. So please take time to check that out also, because Colorado Common Cause does phenomenal work, not only in the state of Colorado, but all over the country. Common Cause offices do great work. While we're waiting for other audience questions to come in, I'm going to jump back to some that came in earlier today. Is it possible for a news outlet to remain truly neutral in our current political environment? And if it does try to remain neutral, does the outlet have to compromise its own obligations within the community?
I can say that this is a question we get a lot, and you hear journalists get a lot, and the answer is remarkably simple. Like it's not nearly as complicated as it seems. It's you focus on facts, and that's really like you cannot go wrong with just putting facts as your North Star and just kind of orienting yourself around that. And so like at any given moment, you can get into the Twitter mentions on coloradosun.com, and we will be either the most liberal rag that they've ever read or the most conservative, depending on how the facts that we reported in the story reflect on that person's particular personal beliefs. And so it's not as hard as it might seem, just because there's so much political noise out there, to remain really strongly neutral. And again, neutral is not equal both sides, and neutral is focused on making sure that the truth of whatever situation is presented as much as possible.
Many people want to see these days media that affirms their thinking.
Right.
And quite frankly, if that's all you're seeing and there are organizations out there, local kind of organizations in Colorado, that are reporting on just one side or another. They're an echo chamber. And if that's all you're seeing, you're doing it wrong. And you should be looking for a wider variety of voices, because that's how we succeed in society, is by listening to a wider variety of voices and not just living in our echo chamber, our little bubble.
Right.
It goes back to what I was saying before about like if all of your headlines are either making you feel really happy or really angry, then you need to diversify your feeds, because a lot of them you should be. It sounds weird to say, you should be maybe either a little bored or a little confused and wanting to know more by a headline. Not necessarily that you need to be like jazzed into sharing it. Like it should intrigue you to educate yourself a little bit more. Yeah. And if you're always angry and always happy, it's the wrong set.
Yeah. Other thoughts on that?
We've it's been interesting at the CUI, like being a student paper, and how politics plays into that, because a lot of the stuff that we report on is nonpartisan. It's related to the campus or what's happening within the kind of academic world, and that's usually kind of something that you would hope politics doesn't really penetrate, but of course it does.
I laugh,
especially
at you.
Here, especially in Colorado. Yeah.
So I think back to this time last year when we were doing around the clock reporting on our new president, Mark Kennedy. Someone who came with a very conservative voting record, was a Republican for the state of Minnesota for several years before he held higher education positions, and then was selected by CU's Board of Regents as the sole finalist. And there was uproar in our community, not just on the Boulder campus, but all the campuses and throughout the state, and even nationally. There were outlets that were covering this. So it was interesting to see. That was like the first real moment in my life as a young journalist where politics was at the core of it in a lot of ways, because all of the coverage was pointing to his record as a politician, and his conservative values and beliefs. And we had LGBT students that were calling him out for his voting record, and all that. So it was really interesting for me and for a lot of us at the CUI to be like, oh wow, okay, like our perfect little bubble of like reporting on the fun events and stuff is over. Like this is here it is. So politics is just always going to be a part of the reporting. And I think it, again, goes back to what was said earlier about just reporting the facts and also comforting, those who are of more vulnerable populations and demographics. Like, our job is not, in that moment, was not to, make Mark Kennedy feel okay and make, it was, we of course were trying to have a balanced story and hear from like the regents and hear from, administration. But as many of us know, they were putting up a lot of walls. And so most of our coverage really was the student voice, and also hearing from, faculty that had concerns. And so someone could easily find that who didn't really understand the context at the time and read those articles now and maybe think, oh, well, they only were interviewing, liberal students who, well, of course, they're not going to agree with him because that, they're liberal and they come from a different spectrum of the political, on the political spectrum. But the context of it wasn't just about, okay, well, this guy, has differing politics. It's that, here is a person that has done and represented and said and stood for, a lot of things and initiatives and bills that, are hurtful to a lot of different people and to a lot of students that make up our readership. And then you loop in, the transparency issues with the Board of Regents and the stonewalling and just all of it. It was just, this big concoction of things. So it wasn't that we came from the angle of like, this is politically charged and we're going to like really use this to like get this guy. It was that we had a responsibility to hear from a large, body that was concerned. So I think just context of the moment as well of like, okay, well, what is like the larger picture of what's going on and like, why are people angry? It's not because maybe it's not necessarily the fact that like he had an R next to his name. It's, you've got to dig deeper than that and see how it is affecting other people and hearing their stories.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I am going to throw out one more thing, and then along with that, if you all can maybe give a final thought or two on the importance of independent media in the state of Colorado. The final one, and it, Sandra, might be something that you can address. I think you brought it up earlier. Can you explain a little bit more about the Colorado, the Hub collaboration, the Media Hub collaboration, and will it be subscription based, and is it online?
The collab really is a collaboration of a bunch of groups, and people are going to be doing different parts of the story. So the Associated Press is a member, the Colorado Sun is a member, Colorado Independent, the Denver Post is participating in this project that's going on today and should come out sometime in the next several days. As our Channel 9, Channel 7, Colorado Public Radio is part. It's more of a loosely structured thing of where people are going to be sharing more content with each other, and also doing projects. There are a lot of smaller newspapers, news outlets from around the state in more rural areas that are participating, and it's a way for a lot of us to work together. I know Eric knows about it some too.
Yeah, and it's a little bit more official sort of version of what we've tried to do a lot with the Sun, where we had a big project on mobile homes last year that we worked with 18 different newsrooms, whether it was small newspapers and public radio and places like that, all kind of covering the one bigger topic and in ways that we know that there's skills in each newsroom that you can apply to that level. And I think that's what Collab is really doing well. So it's the idea that if you already you have your favorite news outlets, you can see that they're participating, but you might be able to discover different news outlets that you might not have thought about before by everyone sort of coming together. So yeah, it's a lot more complementary than it is competitive these days in a lot of this, because we know that there's just so many fewer journalists working.
Right, and I think that's a good note to go out on, in that a lot of us in the industry might know what Collab is, but the consuming public might not realize that there's more and more effort by independent media and like you said, Sandra, some of the radio stations and the TV stations to work together to bring information to all four corners of the state. And on that note, maybe Rep. Cutter, if you want to kind of start taking us out on, just your thoughts from the chair that you sit in on the importance of independent media in the state of Colorado.
I said earlier, I think independent media is incredibly important to Colorado and to all Coloradans. Think about the small town who has, in particular, like we're in a metro area and there's lots of great collaboration and things. But think of some of the small towns, they lose a newspaper the things that go on at the local level affect your life. Like people think of politics as a dirty word. I'm a government servant. I'm here to help you. I'm here to do things for the public. And that's what everyone in government presumably is there to do, is to, they have the ability to impact your lives on a daily basis. Even your who picks up your trash, who, if your roads are getting fixed, all those things. If you don't have journalists watching those things and reporting on those things and holding city council accountable, then that's a huge blow to democracy. And I just think it's really, really important that we do everything possible to continue to sustain and support independent journalism. And I'm really excited, again, to be here with all of you and hear about all the great efforts that are going on in the state.
Well, thank you. And thanks for being here too. Thank you. Eric, you want to go next?
Yeah, and so I'm just going to kind of piggyback a little bit on what Lisa was saying, is that all the oxygen in the room is oftentimes taken up by big national politics, because that tends to be the thing that simultaneously can get you the angriest and you can do the least about. There's you get your say in federal politics once every year, and it usually once every 2 years and once every 4 years, really, for the big stuff. Other than that, like Lisa said, who takes your garbage out, you are going to be experiencing that every single week. And, the level of road funding, that is something that you're going to be driving on every single day. And so these have so much more of an impact than getting mad about, the Senate at that point. Not saying that isn't important, but in a proportional way of the way that it affects your life. This is really, this is why you need to not only pay more attention to your local, politics and lifestyle and even just everything that's going on in your state, but find the people who are helping you understand that and make sure that they are both supported and that you're doing everything you can to spread the word on the good news that people are actually putting out there.
Great.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Sandra?
Just homeschool a kid on local government and media, please. I mean, now's your chance.
Yeah, really. Now that would be the time to really get deep and
I
teach
can point you to some resources.
Yeah.
and I like how you said there's a math lesson in there too.
Right.
It's so true. Robert, university student.
I want independent journalism to stick around so that I can be a part of it. I think this moment right now is the perfect example of why journalism is so important. This pandemic that has completely upended the way that we go about our lives. There's so many aspects of it, from just we need the vital life-saving information and updates from our city councils and our governor and all of that is reported on by the media. But also, like, it's been amazing to just see the human stories that are being told, the way that journalists are both documenting and helping to change history right now. And it also kind of brings another important thing for journalism for that a lot of people don't always think about, is that, like, journalism is a public forum, and it's a place where to build community and to tell and share stories, and it's not always doom and gloom, and that we don't want it to be like what the Colorado Sun is doing right now with this Right On Colorado not competition, but this Right On Colorado project has been so cool, and it's been so cool to see how other outlets are trying to bring in community members that way to really band together in what is a pretty scary and uncertain time. So reasons like this are why we need local journalism, and we're really seeing the effects of it on the local and the national level.
Agreed. Thank you. And I really want to thank the panelists. I want to really give my gratitude to Colorado Common Cause for pivoting their happy hour tonight to an online forum, curating this panel and being a conduit for the conversation here in Colorado. So thank you, Common Cause, and thank you, panelists.
Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This is great.